Everything that has been tested as part of the techno-tyranny, which is potentially rolling in, has been tested on Palestinians for years, whether it's genocide AI, genocide surveillance, genocide smart cities. Everything has been tested on Palestinians before it's being rolled out globally.
It's very obvious that no matter how many, you know, great Jewish voices or how many Western voices are speaking out in favor of X cause, the reality is the people can only rely on the resistance.
They are the ones stepping in to uphold the Genocide Convention. Where are China and Russia on the Genocide Convention? Why aren't they adhering to that?
We somehow can't get together to do something to stop a genocide. We still have economic relationships happening with Israel, not just with the US and the EU and UK, but you have them happening with Russia. And what people have taken Russia to be is an ideological version of the Soviet Union, which it isn't. It is a capitalist country. It is a country that is very practical in terms of its government. It's very different than what people want it to be, I think. And that goes with any other major world power, be it China as well. And they are putting in their desires for what they want the world to look like instead of what the world actually is, the real politic of the world as it exists right now. We don't hear people in the region and West Asia talk about what happened, what Russia's role in Syria. We're not hearing them talk about, their relationship with Israel. You'd be surprised. You'd think we were the only ones talking about it. That nobody talks about it. It's like it's the elephant in the room that doesn't get talked about when it's very clear that relationship is there. So I think there needs to be a reality check, essentially.
Okay, good day, everyone. We are here again with another show with my friend Peter and two very distinguished guests, Vanessa Beeley and Fiorella Isabel. You two do a lot of work on, well, you could say on anti-imperialism, journalism in West Asia, Russia. I think you're based in Russia, right, Fiorella? You're based in West Asia, Vanessa. And I think you guys do a lot of very good work, and you have very, how can I say it, a different and a very nuanced look on many things that happen around the world, which we find very appealing. And before we go into the questions, maybe you guys can introduce yourself a bit. How did you roll into this kind of work that you're doing now, that kind of stuff? And let's start with Vanessa.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for having us on. I'm really looking forward to it, actually. Yeah, basically, I started as an activist, like many journalists did. I went to Gaza in 2012, and then my journey took me through the areas of the region that are, of course, under the imperialist jackboot, whether it's by Zionist proxy, Takfiri proxy, regardless. And I was living in Syria for the last 5 years. So I basically developed from being an activist to being an investigative journalist, working extensively in Syria from 2016 and living there from 2019 until December 2024, when, of course, Damascus finally fell after a 14-year regime change war. And now I'm based in Lebanon after that. So that's it, really. I do it because my conscience kind of dictates that I do it, because it's my country that's responsible for everything pretty much that has happened globally through partitioning and through imperialism. So I feel I have, I don't want to say like a duty, that sounds so, but I feel that I need to do it. I need to actually transmit the voices from here that are so often disappeared, not only by mainstream media, but even by independent media very often. And I think, that's a failing on our part in independent media, that we don't amplify those voices more.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. Fiorella?
Yeah, so I actually went to school for journalism, but I also did a lot of PR, and I got to see like the dirty side of the communications aspect. But I really got into the politics of it all through Los Angeles, being there and seeing the poverty that already had begun in, I would say, 2013, 2014, and got into the Bernie Sanders campaign thinking that it was the last chance that we had. And I think it was. And after that, of course, we have seen what's transpired the last 10 years since, which it's crazy to think about 10 years ago, um, being so naive and so like optimistic about things. And a lot of people say Vanessa and I are black pilled, but what we really are is
Yeah.
experienced in our respective areas. For me, it's been the United States. I followed a lot of the movements that have happened since then. I followed all the protests, all the counter protests that occurred, the several elections, and then I went, of course, abroad, particularly to Latin America. I have been to West Asia as well, but now I live in Russia, and I came here at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and now 3 years later, we're seeing just what has happened since, and the fall of Syria really just did it in terms of redefining and humbling us as to what could particularly come to be, and the idealism that a lot of us had placed on certain sectors of what we perceive to be the non-aligned access or the anti-imperialist contingents. And so for me, the reason I do this, it's because I genuinely have an investigative, curious mind, but also it is much bigger than any sort of just job or check to cash in. I worked with RT before. I am now fully independent in terms of my journalistic work. And I think being independent, I came from the independent world, and being independent for me is the best form, because I think it's just so difficult to really have the editorial freedom that you have when you're independent. So yeah, I do think that there's a certain level of duty, as Vanessa said, and I do think that the majority of independent media is very much focused on the breaking news aspects of things, but at a very superficial level, not at the in-depth level. And then it becomes repetition of what like six people who are deemed experts say, and everybody else just follows that narrative. There's no more questioning anymore, which is kind of interesting considering independent media is supposed to be different. And now we've had the rise of the alternative mainstream media, which is like the captured sort of, I come from the mainstream media, but now I have gone independent access, which is like interesting. And the reason they're doing it is because that's the only way that people are watching now. So people nowadays don't really watch mainstream news, at least in the United States. And I also believe the United States is the biggest obstacle and hurdle to any progress and any peace as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Very well said. Very well said. And
Yeah.
I remember Fiorella back in the day. That's one of the moments of the independent media that actually stuck with me. And that when you talk about those Bernie Sanders days, I think we were all caught in that kind of fantasy and belief. And I never forget, coincidentally, because I was not very much aware of you back then, but I remember seeing a video of yours where you were very emotional about the Bernie loss. Was that, or that was Bernie? No, no, no. Bernie leaving the cause, or just messing it up. I remember you were really emotional, and it was so genuine. And I remember really understanding why you felt that way. Do you remember that moment? You were very emotional in front of the camera.
Yeah, I think it was Jimmy Dore who I guess had shown it at some point. I think it was, I don't remember. I think it was definitely 2020. So I was accused of of trying to sabotage a campaign when it was really the other way around. His campaign was infiltrated with operatives from the establishment. And I was trying to let people know that. And it was like, and I knew that was, so 2016 was truly the last chance because by 2020, the entirety of any sort of independent movements that came together from left, right, everywhere that had existed was completely captured. And so I was trying to explain that and said that this is, it's just devastating because
Yes.
like people didn't really see what was happening. And so I guess it got around or whatever. But yeah, that it was just really it was just kind of like seeing what would happen after that. And everything that has happened since has just gotten 10,000 times worse. And it's just like as a
Yeah.
person, I'm just thinking, looking back, and I'm like, oh, you sweet summer child, you had no idea what was gonna come and where we're at now. I mean, now it's just like every day something is happening, and it's impossible to keep up with everything happening all at once.
Yeah, it's interesting. The political economy of media in the US has been on a downward trajectory in the sense of there's even before the internet, major media companies were cutting journalists, like actual journalists who go to the location, collect information, and then provide it. So now with new media on the internet, what you have is like a lot more different voices, but they're all basically interpreting much the same information that's gathered by the wire services and the
Yeah.
existing legacy outlets. And the problem is funding. Like, you can
Yeah.
work your day job and then go and give your commentary in the evening on your free time, but it's very different compared to when your day job is collecting information from the source. So, I mean, the state of the news media, particularly in the U.S., but I worry that it's the same basic trend is occurring around the world. It's quite a sad state.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And well, I'll shift gears here a little bit, and I do want to talk a bit about about the things that are going on right now. And like I said, one of the reasons I wanted to get both of you on our show, Vanessa and Fiorella, is you guys regularly do a show together. You also write on Substack, and when you guys discuss together about, for example, what's going on in West Asia or with Ukraine and Russia and all these big players in the imperialism, in the world of imperialism, there's something that I really notice, and it is that your the way you guys speak, the way you guys analyze, is such a breath of fresh air compared to what you mostly, and not everyone, there are quite some good people, but what you mostly hear in the anti-imperialist sphere, especially coming from the usual suspects, let's put it that way. And like I said, two women, that is also rare, I must say, and that is also a breath of
Yeah.
fresh air. And you guys seem to have a very nuanced analysis, I must say, that respects the region and also the viewpoint of the people involved, instead of what you often see, these infantilizing, judgmental ways in which many of the so-called anti-imperialists speak about people across the world. For example, in West Asia, I did a lot of shows with our good friend Dimitri Laskaris about how many so-called anti-imperialists are always talking about the Arabs. So the Arabs this, the Arabs this, that. It's the same now with the genocide in Palestine. Oh, the Arabs are doing nothing. It's not about the Arabs. I can't stand these kind of generalizations. It's the same with people who always say the Jews, who just generalize everybody. And um, so that brings me to a question that was really on my mind. And that is, we now see a lot of things going on in West Asia, in particular, of course, in Palestine, Syria, um, and there is a new government in a so-called new government in Syria. I
Mm.
have to carefully choose my words, in regime, whatever, uh, uh,
Yeah.
uh, run by Al Jolani. and after the overthrow of Assad. And there are many people in the anti-imperialist sphere who blame, again, the Arabs for what is happening in West Asia, because there seem to be some who actually celebrate what happened to Assad and also seem to be celebrating the neo-Jolani government. Now, I also talk a lot with our friend Kevork Almashan. He often is very disappointed about what's going on. He sees a lot of celebration of, for example, Al-Jolani. My question is, before I ramble on for too long, is
Yeah.
there actually, and that is something that Kevork often says, is there a big lack of anti-imperialist consciousness in many parts of West Asia that explains why it seems that there are so many people celebrating actually the rule of Al-Jolani? Or are we missing things? What is your conception of what is going on right now over there? And maybe we can start with you, Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the education process in certain countries within West Asia has been changed as a result of the Jared Kushner created Abraham Accords that, of course, were brought in under the last Trump administration. I think both Fee and I agree that, American politics is a circus. Presidents are brought in to run certain sections of the deep state Pentagon roadmap. They're not actually elected. They're chosen to run a certain period of time. And Trump is always the economic hitman. He's always the one that's going to come in bringing the hope of negotiations, while at the same time, of course, during his last administration, he assassinated Soleimani and Mohandas, the leader of the PMU forces in Iraq. He's often kind of slightly forgotten when we're talking about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was largely responsible for the defeat of ISIS both in Iraq and Syria. And through that normalization process, particularly in the Gulf states, there has been a process of changing the education system where the criminalization of Israel or the Zionist entity is being eradicated. And so therefore that normalization process is being done even through education, which of course is a typical Zionist tactic. Zionism as an ideology is bred into children through schools from the age of kindergarten, both in Israel and in countries across the world, right? So this is a familiar strategy by them, which has been repeated in the Gulf states, so in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, which although they haven't yet fully normalized with Israel, they've been going through this process for some time. And it's kind of a done deal, as we've just seen with Trump's trip to West Asia, including his discussions, which we can come on to later, with Jolani in Saudi Arabia before he headed to Qatar. In the rest of the region, I think you have to take it kind of slightly country by country. I don't think you can generalize across the board. I think a similar process, funnily enough, was happening in Syria. I think there was a degree of loss of focus on who the real enemy was in Syria, partly because of 14 years of regime change war, but also, again, thanks to Trump, from 2020 onwards, there was huge economic pressure on Syria, kind of, I don't really like saying post-war because the war wasn't over, it had just taken a long pause, as we know now. And Trump brought in the Caesar sanctions, which collectively punished any country that would even come to the assistance of Syria and provide reconstruction aid or any kind of aid for the civilian population, 90% of which were living well below whatever poverty line you want to put out there as a standard, right? And so I think at that point, people were focusing inwards rather than outwards, and were forgetting who the real enemy was. They were getting wrapped up in the fact that, yes, there was flourishing corruption, which again, I'm not excusing the Syrian government for allowing that to happen, but I'm also saying that's part of the entire Takfiri project in Syria was to create the environment in which corruption could flourish and poverty could deepen, right? This is a blueprint which we saw back in Yugoslavia, and it's been repeated ever since. And so I think that focus, however, has remained very steadfast amongst the resistance factions in Iraq and in Lebanon, and particularly in Yemen. Yemen, I think, for me, is a benchmark of what resistance should be. It's operating under international law. It's adhering to the Geneva Convention to prevent genocide. It's trying to prevent and punish genocide, and it's being punished for doing so by Trump and by the United States, and of course by Israel and the UAE and the other Gulf states, etc., that had waged the war against Yemen since 2015. So I think I wouldn't kind of make this a blanket statement, but I would say that it's part of the process of taking the eye off the ball. And also, when you drown people in economic misery and lack of hope, lack of dignity, the destruction of infrastructure, the destruction of your society for 14 years, with actually, I mean, we'll come on to this, with actually, and people are going to throw their hands up in horror, with very little practical help from the allies, and that includes Russia and Iran. Iran, of course, was providing the oil. They were doing their best, but they're also under heavy sanctions. And so I think at that point, the celebrations came from the fact that any change was to be welcomed. And I think people lost their rationale for a while. It came back very quickly. I mean, I had friends who were saying to me on day one, yeah, well, like it's going to be better. It has to be better. It has to be better than what we had before. And then within 24 hours, they were saying, oh, no, I was stupid to even think that, So I think the cruelty of what the West engineered in Syria is what really traumatized so many people. Myself and Fee included, myself particularly because I was there during the last days, and it became very apparent that there was a major betrayal, not only internally, but externally. And we can come on to that in a minute. But, the real politic games that these so-called non-aligned countries are playing should be highlighted. And of course, every time we do that, we get called, or I get called, controlled opposition, or I'm against a multipolar world, or I'm against BRICS, I'm against the and it's not that, but we can't kind of shelve our ability to rationalize just because an ideology is preventing that. And I think that's a huge problem. People are ideologically invested in there being some kind of alternative to what we've experienced for decades with the imperialist axis. But I'm not so sure that we're seeing anything massively different. It might just be a little bit better in how it plays out. But I think we all need to be aware that we're still kind of dealing with the same paradigm. It just has a slightly different color. It has a slightly different shape. But going forward, I think we need to be prepared for there not being any huge difference or any great equity, particularly for those countries. I don't like using terms like global south or undeveloped countries, because they're only undeveloped because they've not been allowed to develop, because they have the majority of the resources, particularly here in West Asia. And that includes Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world. Why is that? So I think, until I see a level of equity for those countries being perpetrated or being allowed to happen by the ruling, powerful countries of this world, I find it hard to believe in there being any massive alternative to what we see now.
That's such a good point. For people that are getting disheartened, nobody likes to feel naive, right? I would recommend spending some time reading international relations theory, reading about realpolitik, so you understand like how the world has been for what, 10,000 years since sedentary civilizations, essentially. Well summarized by Thucydides, the strong do as they will, the weak suffer as they must. Really absorb that and understand the logic that is imposed on countries by the structure. Not to say you give up your hopes, but just so that you lose your naivete and you don't get disappointed when your dreams about what might be coming because of whatever reason you have, so you don't just burn out. It might be disheartening, but I think understanding the system is the first step towards changing it. And of course, the states with the most power in the system are the ones that can actually change that structure.
Fiorella, maybe you have some thoughts?
Well, she said a lot there that's crucial, and I just want to add on a couple of points. What I've seen in West Asia, the same thing that plagues Latin America is this, when you are, and speaking also as a Latin American, when you are suffering, as Vanessa said, from the sanctions, from the economic turmoil, you are not always aware of where it's coming from. And the easiest and closest thing you have is your government. And with the mounds and mounds of propaganda that exists in favor of the United States, in favor of the West, as the saviors of society. Oh, perhaps maybe if we get more foreign investment, maybe we will have better paying jobs. Maybe it's great that the US comes in with their business. This is what people are told in a lot of these societies, and especially what I've seen in Latin America as well. And that's how you have the contingents that kind of support entities in the West that are actually acting against them, robbing the resources of these countries, very mineral rich countries in South America and Central America, all over Africa and West Asia, but ending up being poor, right? This is like what we call the global South. But why are they poor? Well, because that is the state they are meant to be kept in. And they're also meant to be kept in a status of any hatred that's developed from these sanctions. For example, Venezuela, the hatred goes directly to the president, the same way we saw in Syria. And so there is also this idea that Vanessa and I have discussed, I think, several times, where there's the colonized minds, even within the anti-imperialist sectors, where there's this desire, and I have a huge problem with this, there's this desire to get the Western chauvinistic image to represent your cause, whether it's the Palestinian cause or whether it's any other cause of quote unquote anti-imperialism. You're going to the same type of Western male chauvinistic viewpoint. And I'm not saying that people who are Western and males can't have a good viewpoint. That is not what I'm saying at all. And saying this, by the way, isn't wokeism, because that's essentially what it's going to get called. But what I am saying is that these things exist, these presentations exist, these internal self type of hatred, this self type of complexes exist in a lot of Native populations. And it is something that there has to be a surpassing of that and an understanding of it as well. And I'm not going to tell individual peoples of individual countries how they have to do the things they have to do. But again, as a Latin American, I definitely see it, and I've definitely spoken about it. And I think that's part of the problem in terms of really understanding how the people can get out of it themselves. Because if we're looking at right now what's happening in Gaza, literally the only people, as Vanessa said, or one of the only examples of the strongest armed resistance are Yemen. And these are the resistance. You can only count on the resistance. And so for me, it's very obvious that no matter how many, great Jewish voices or how many Western voices are speaking out in favor of X cause, the reality is The people can only rely on the resistance. The people experiencing what they're experiencing now in Gaza, while, for example, Donald Trump and Netanyahu are having a fight. Ooh, let's talk about that for like 10 days straight. Meanwhile, Gaza is getting completely bombarded by land, air, and sea. And there's an actual incursion happening, a ground level incursion happening by the IOF. And you're still seeing people go along with this narrative that is sanctioned by the United States. But somehow, because all these Western pundits are saying this, it must be true. And I think there needs to be a look internally as to how are we doing this? Why are we falling into the same mechanisms of that? And the other point that Vanessa made about this multipolar world, and I have been one of the ones hearing it most because I am in Russia. And what people have taken Russia to be is an ideological version of the Soviet Union, which it isn't. It is a capitalist country. It is a country that is very practical in terms of its government. It's very different than what people want it to be, I think. And that goes with any other major world power, be it China as well. And they are putting in their desires for what they want the world to look like instead of what the world actually is, the real politic of the world as it exists right now. Because we can all do that. We can all hope and believe that things are going to be amazing with this new multipolar world order. But at the end of the day, there is absolutely no equity that I'm seeing as long as the replica of BRICS, for example, is going and looking at the UN Charter, the UN, which is completely manipulated by the West. And it's if you're following along those lines, then what exactly are you doing that's so different than what exists, other than now instead of the US and UK and Europe, now you have the US, you have China, you have Russia, maybe Iran, maybe India, maybe, you have more of the powerful, but you still have Israel. You still have a genocide in Gaza. You still don't have any of these major world powers stopping Israel via economic sanctions, via some sort of military type of intervention. We have military interventions everywhere, but we somehow can't get together to do something to stop a genocide. We still have economic relationships happening with Israel, not just with the US and the EU and UK, but you have them happening with Russia. You have them happening with other countries that are in the so-called global South. So what exactly is going to be so different when we have allowed the dehumanization of these people and the complete eradication of any sort of principles that we have just because they're Palestinian and they're not in Europe this time around? And so I think a lot of people don't want to hear that hard truth. So they just say, oh, you're just blackpilled, you're being negative. It's like, no, we're actually looking at things as they are rather than as we would like them to be.
Yeah. And I just want to, sorry, if I
Go
can
ahead,
just also add something to that, because I think another issue is, and I'm seeing it more and more now, even among people from the region, people in Iran, it's very focused in on Israel as being the problem. The Zionist entity, but instead of actually understanding that Israel is just the tip of the spear, right? It's the central hub of the Zionist movement, but the radiation of the Zionist movement is global. And that means it's embedded in Russia, it's embedded, I don't know to what degree in China. Perhaps you could elucidate on that, but certainly in the US, it's pretty much controlling policy there across a number of sectors. In the UK, just look at the 2030 UK-Israel roadmap to understand to what extent the infiltration by the Zionist movement into UK society has happened and is happening and is going to be happening in the future. And of course, everything that has been tested as part of the techno-tyranny, which is potentially rolling in, has been tested on Palestinians for years, whether it's genocide AI, genocide surveillance, genocide smart cities. Everything has been tested on Palestinians before it's being rolled out globally. And this is a concept that is very difficult to even raise here, because the focus is very much on Israel as a pinpoint for this focus. Now, from my perspective, Israel could pretty much move anywhere. The US could take over the positioning in the Middle East to continue its intelligence, surveillance, military operations, right? It's already building military presence in the Negev for some time. Now we've got US private military contractors operating in Gaza for the last few months, running the so-called aid depots and so on and so forth. So that crossover between the US and Israel, I think Kennedy said it most clearly, Robert Kennedy Jr., before the elections, when he basically said, look, they're essential to us as a bulwark in the Middle East. They provide us with interference, they provide us with surveillance, intelligence, military outposts. We all know that, but that doesn't mean it can't be interchangeable, right? So I think getting people to radiate that focus out and see how that hub of pure evil, as far as I'm concerned, has managed to expand globally over the years. And that's what the Zionist movement was actually designed to do. And it's worked. It's been incredibly successful. And it's hidden, of course, it's the hidden hand behind much of the dealings and economic and trade development globally. And that trying to explain that is a huge stumbling block for people to really understand that even if Israel collapsed tomorrow, and there is potential of civil war, there is potential of replacement of Netanyahu, it's not going to make any difference to the direction of travel. And this is it. We get so distracted away from, like Fee said, everyone's talking about Trump and Netanyahu falling out, right? No one's paying attention to the continuing direction of travel, which doesn't change. All of this are just kind of, irrelevant distractions on that road. And the problem is that so many of us take our eye off the ball and forget where we're actually heading.
Yeah, to use your figure of speech, if Israel is the tip of the spear, then Saudi is part of the side, and Egypt is another part, and UAE. So, yeah.
UAE. I'm going to talk to Gerald Horn soon about UAE and what they are doing in Africa and that kind of stuff. They are also going full-blown imperialist, and so you guys said so many very good things, and I totally agree on that multipolarity aspect. And also you said, Fiorella, about the colonial internalized colonialism. That is stuff that I do a lot of work on, actually, as an academic here in Asia. I call it colonial mentality, and that's just such a good point. You'll be baffled how well the Western Empire has just mentally colonized people all over the world. And when I'm luckily, I have a lot of mainland Chinese students now, and they're much less mentally colonized, I must say. But back in the day, for example, when I was teaching in Malaysia, but also a lot of Hong Kong students, there's still such a mythological idea about the West in their minds, and just such a lack of understanding about global dynamics. The belief in liberalism and human rights and all that kind of stuff. And that also, and what you also said about the anti-imperialist sphere, that kind of, on this side, people are also colonized in a way, in that kind of Western chauvinistic way. And it reminded me of a discussion I had with somebody who also is a very very intellectual, well-thinking kind of a person who is also highly anti-imperialist. And we had a discussion where I said I'm super disappointed in Russia and China as major powers just not doing anything to stop the genocide. And then that person said to me, I kid you not, that person said to me, why do Chinese and Russians have to do anything for Palestinians? Palestinians, the South Africans were also saved themselves and did not ask Russia or China to help them.
They did.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
did.
They did.
I replied. Yeah, I replied that they had international help. But
Yeah, yeah.
the point that person was making was like, okay, seriously, the Palestinians should not feel entitled to have some external power to help them. They need to find a way to resist and help themselves. And then what immediately came in my mind is like, we don't even realize how ethnicized and racialized that way of thinking is. That's Western thinking. The idea that because they are Chinese from a different nation state and a different race and a different ethnicity, races don't exist, but let's say that for the moment. Therefore, the Palestinians should not rely or expect any help from the Chinese. In other words, you cut off humanity based on their ethnicity, and therefore don't expect any help from other groups of people. That's pure racialism that cuts humanity up. I say personally, we as humanity have a responsibility to help each other. Period. I don't care what somebody's ethnicity is. And if you are a major power like China or Russia, you have a responsibility to use that power to protect the weak. I'm giving you a parallel. If a 20-year-old boy is beating up a 5-year-old boy, I'm not going to say that 5-year-old boy is not entitled to help. That 20, we as adults have a responsibility to help that 5-year-old protect that child against that 20-year-old who's beating him up. So it's just very weird to me that we cannot have that expectation on a macro level. I mean, these are major powers, and in my opinion, there's just nothing happening, and I'm just baffled by that. What was your opinion about this?
I mean, if I can just step in, I find that extraordinary because when you look at Yemen, who's been subject to an aggression that should never have happened since March 2015. And Jamal Ben Omar, who was the UN envoy at the time, said there's no need for aggression because Yemen had politically resolved their issues themselves. And it was the criminal former president who betrayed his own mandate, who resigned twice, fled to Aden, and then called in Saudi Arabia bombers to hit his own people in Yemen. And of course, that is what has continued ever since. Yemen, that was completely under blockade during that time because of UN Resolution 2216 that penalized 7 named individuals in Yemen, but the Saudis and the UAE and Israel and the US and the UK used it as a means to effectively blockade 23 million Yemenis. And the UN imposed the verification mechanism, which delayed shipping into the various ports even more. And despite all of that, they are the ones stepping in to uphold the Genocide Convention. Where are China and Russia on the Genocide Convention? Why aren't they adhering to that? So in a sense, they're indirectly increasing that dehumanization, as you said, of the Palestinians, of the Lebanese, because it's not only Hezbollah fighters that were killed in southern Lebanon, it's thousands of civilians, children, the pager attacks. Where was their real intervention and condemnation of the pager attacks that effectively mutilated thousands of children, women, civilians, fighters? It doesn't matter, even if they were fighters. It was a terrorist act on foreign soil. And yet it was never condemned. Israel is never held to account by these countries. And this is when they're talking, when they're kind of glorifying the UN Charter and international law, where are they? And people get really angry with me, for example, when I point out that China was basically bleeding Yemen dry with the Ansarullah, the Salvation Government, which is a coalition of 38 political parties. They were bleeding it dry of its own economic riches by stealing the oil and paying the Saudi puppet, to the point where Ansarullah were threatening to target Chinese ships if they kept coming and taking their oil off the south coast, and they were effectively paying lower rates to the Saudis. So, these countries are perfectly capable of exploiting misery and poverty and a lack of development in these countries just as much as any other. And I'm sorry to have to say that. I would love to say there is this huge difference. And yes, China does invest. It does help to build infrastructure. But it's not doing it just for the benefit of that country, nor should it in a genuinely pragmatic environment. But at the same time, look at where China is investing globally. Look at the investment in the occupied port of Haifa, for example, in Israel, right? So they can't have their ideology and then not be capable of actually saying, but in these aspects, China and Israel betray my belief in their ideology.
Yeah, and just to point out, like the Genocide Convention puts a positive duty on all signatories to prevent genocide. In our countries, well, yeah, Holland and the U.S., we're not just not preventing genocide, we're actively co-perpetrating it. But you do have all of the countries that joined in on the ICJ case. That's something, but you really need to have unity with the rest of the world outside of the US and Europe, or else you just don't have enough power, and the effect that you'll get, the counterattack that you'll get could be absolutely disruptive. I mean, I'm no fan of the Egyptian government by any means, but you can just think for a second, put yourselves in their shoes. They're like, okay, if we say opened up an aid route through a tunnel into Gaza, the US would cut us off from the global economy. We would be plunged into poverty. Now you could say, well, still you have a moral obligation, and I would probably agree with you, because you'd probably want to try to deal with those economic sanctions and the destruction of your country through other means, again, through unity with other countries. But that gets back to your original point about structure, the realpolitik structure that we're all living in, and is often invisible to people. So they have trouble understanding why countries do what they do. The fundamental need that we have is to change that structure.
Your thoughts, Fiorella?
Yeah, well, I just want to say that I think if we haven't the existence of NATO, if you have the existence of the Five Eyes, if you have the existence of the West as a whole that is continuously aligned, for example, with each other, right? They have formed these strong blocks, these strong alliances, and you don't have something to counteract that is equally as strong or unified, you're not going to win. And I think people get mixed up in this scenario because they're like, well, Russia and China respect the sovereignty of countries to make their own decisions. Okay, that's great. But where does that leave the less powerful countries that saw what happened to Syria, and then they're like, oh, okay, well, no one's going to come to our rescue when the United States decides to overthrow Maduro, or no one's going to come to our rescue when, XYZ happens, and so on and so forth. Oh, yeah, they know that they have to rescue themselves to a degree. Every country has to do, whatever they can for themselves, and we have seen that. However, we can't expect to have this idea that people have created as this sort of Marvel comic book where you have, the anti-imperialist sector fighting against the empire, when it doesn't exist, when the anti-imperialist sector is non-aligned entirely, and some of them are operating pragmatically and some of them are operating ideologically. And you have the resistance, which is, I'm not saying it's not pragmatic at all, but it is an ideological belief that it's fighting against the evil access. It is fighting for its existence, and it is fighting to overcome this. Whereas you have other countries like Russia that is operating the government is operating in a very pragmatic way to expand its economic reach, to find more mutual interests and new partnerships with other countries in the global south. That's what it's doing. That's what Russia's doing. It's trying to grow internally, domestically, as well as internationally. So when you have these countries, these individual sovereign states operating from different points of view and not as a unified bloc, you're not going to be able to defeat a bloc that is unified, no matter how much certain sectors believe in the cause, because they're not operating in unison. And so I would argue that in these instances, it is absolutely required that you form some sort of alliance against that, and that it is an actual alliance, not an alliance where you're like, oh, well, you do your thing and we'll do our thing, and maybe we can combine our things together eventually. You're never going to defeat the empire. And it just doesn't work. It's not logistical. It's not even pragmatic at that point, because you have different goals and you have different strategies and tactics that you're using. So while I support the idea of sovereign states and I support all states in their right to choose, if all of these states eventually want to survive, because the minute, for example, that the Trump administration says, all right, we're not going to deal with Russia, we'll push it down to the next Democrat that comes in, even if we resolve the Russia-Ukraine issue, it's going to come back and haunt them again. They're not done with Russia. It doesn't matter what happens today, tomorrow. The US, Europe, NATO is not done with Russia until it is balkanized. And if you don't make the right alliances and look at what's going to happen down the road, and if Russia thinks it's more important to have a relationship with Israel, which they do think it's important, and they do have a relationship with Israel, and it's not just because of the 1.3 million Russians living in Tel Aviv, but it is beyond that. They cannot. They need to understand there is a limit to that relationship when Israel and the United States are like this. When Israel will always choose itself over anybody else. I mean, they've been choosing Ukraine this entire time. So there needs to be a both, I think, ideological and pragmatic union against the empire if there is to truly be a rebalancing of power. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're just allowing the countries that believe that, hey, maybe we can have these relationships with Russia, with China, and have a more equitable partnership. Sure, to a degree, as Vanessa said, there's investments. It's not what the United States does, but how long is that going to last before you end up in the same place? And so I think that there needs to be an intrinsic look as to where we go from here, for these individual countries and the reality of it. You can't say anything. For example, we don't hear people in the region and West Asia talk about what happened, what Russia's role in Syria. We're not hearing them talk about, their relationship with Israel. You'd be surprised. You'd think we were the only ones talking about it. That nobody talks about it. It's like it's the elephant in the room that doesn't get talked about when it's very clear that relationship is there. So I think there needs to be a reality check, essentially.
Well, the Bandung spirit needs to be revived a bit, I also would say. And it reminds me a bit of what Gerald Horn always says. He says there's just such a severely lacking international cooperation in the anti-imperialist kind of spheres. To give you an example, I'm always surprised to see the same battles being fought in Africa as in West Asia. And why are these resistance movements not flying to each other and having conferences, having meetings? And I'm just so surprised. The same in Latin America, there are so many fights that are identical and they're all fractured. It's baffling to me. And I know we're already at the hour, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but you bring something that I wanted to ask, actually. And that brings me to what Vanessa said in one of the shows. That was really I liked it a lot. You said that the pragmatism versus morality. Okay, the question of pragmatism versus morality. We, in the end, we are human beings. We have a we have a sense of morality. You know, I find it so good that you actually said that when talking about, for example, Russia's role with vis-a-vis Israel. And that brings me also to something that I've noticed in the anti-imperialist sphere, and Fiorella, you touched on that a little bit just now, is that we have a taboo also in the anti-imperialist sphere. We are not allowed to say certain things. For example, we have a corner in the anti-imperialist spheres that are very much celebratory about China. If you go to their channels, it's always everything is fantastic that's happening in China. Now, don't get me wrong, I live in China. I love it. It's an amazing country. It's an amazing culture, and I'm glad we have some counterweight to Western imperialism in that sense. But if you watch these channels, it's just everything is perfect and great and dandy, and that is just not nuance. And it's the same when it comes to Russia and Putin for many of these figures, and to such an extent that if you critique it a little bit, Russia's policy or Putin, you have your comment sections full with like, I loved your channel until your discussion on Putin. Unsubscribed. And I'm like, okay, if we cannot even have nuanced discussions about the things that are happening in the international relations, we're getting nowhere. You know what I mean? And so my question is, Vanessa, what happened, if you can say that? I heard a lot of times, so it's going to be hard, but what happened in Syria? Did Russia actually stab Syrians in the back? Did Russia screw Syrians over? How do you say it? Screw them over in English?
Yeah.
What? There's a sneaky play going on, I think, and I think you may have a bit more information on that, Vanessa.
Well, I think, I'll try to keep it brief. I think Fee and I were talking, even before Trump had been elected, that Trump is always brought in to do the deals, as I said. And it became kind of more and more apparent to me that there were deals going on, that there was potential for there to be a deal over Ukraine. And if there were to be such a deal, I will also make the point that that deal, in my opinion, couldn't be made without Israel lobbying for Russia, just as Israel is lobbying for Russia to consolidate its military base in the coastal area to prevent the neo-Ottoman expansion from Erdogan. And so Israel and Russia are collaborating at the moment in Syria to enable Russia to stay on the coast. The US has taken the condition for Russia to leave off the table with Jolani because they've achieved their normalization with Israel and various other things that they wanted to achieve inside Syria militarily and economically. But I think, in my opinion, Russia had reached the end of the road in Syria. I think they decided, look, they weren't going to be putting any more investment into Syria. They'd had the rights to the exploitation of the gas on the Levant coast since 2013. They'd done nothing with it. People complain about how Trump and the West were using proxies in Syria, and in the northeast in particular, yes, they were. ISIS and the Kurdish separatists were exploiting Syrian resources to basically provide revenue for them so the US didn't have to pay them. That's one aspect. But Russia was not any different. The Wagner Group were operating in Syria from 2015 until 2023, and they were creaming profit off the oil and gas fields that they expanded into after the military operations. And that the profits from those elements that they had control of were not being taxed by the Russian state. So in other words, Russia was keeping Wagner in Syria so they didn't have to put their own forces on the ground. And at the same time, they were allowing Wagner to profit from Syrian resources for it to trickle down to some of the ruling elite in Syria, which of course then didn't benefit the actual state and population itself. So there's a mirroring between what Russia did in Syria to a lesser degree, obviously, than what the US and alliance did, running the whole Takfiri project to effect regime change. And I think in the end, when Assad was not following through on Russian recommendations to pivot to the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia and to UAE, which of course ultimately would mean normalization with Israel, and Assad was refusing to meet with President Erdogan to resolve the differences in Syria, because Assad was basically needing guarantees from Erdogan that he would withdraw entirely from Syrian territory. I think the Russians in the end, for some time after 2020, had been thinking, this isn't worth the investment. It's not going anywhere. Assad is not going to do what we want. And so I think ultimately, again, I was on the ground, and people get very angry with me when I talk about this. In Putin's speech after the fall of Damascus, he made the point that the Syrian army surrendered. And so why would Russia keep fighting? That's not true. The Syrian army didn't surrender until it was forced to, and it was forced to because the commanders that were still fighting were taken off the field by traitors within the military complex in Syria, and they were then replaced by commanders that were under the control of Russia. And at that point, the Syrian army was told to withdraw. Certain brigades were told to surrender. Others were not given the message, so some kept fighting. Their comrades next to them had already surrendered, so they were surrounded very quickly. Russia was bombing empty ground. I was told that by multiple military contacts during the fight. And if you imagine from Aleppo to northern Hama or southern Idlib, it's empty ground, it's flat ground. So it's clear vision for targeting an entire convoy of HTS, and yet none of those convoys were destroyed. So this raises a question to me: what was Russia actually bombing? Was it actually genuinely trying to prevent the HTS advance or not? Just as America didn't prevent the ISIS advance from Ramadi in Iraq to Deir ez-Zor back in whenever it was 2013, where they covered 500 kilometers to enter Syrian territory under US surveillance. So I think, the pragmatism comes in. They didn't want to keep investing. They understood that there was a deal to be made on Ukraine. Israel, I think, was instrumental in securing that deal and then securing Russia's remaining presence in Syria, which of course is helpful for them in Libya and North Africa. And it makes them not entirely reliant on Turkey. This is another main point here. Turkey and Russia, although being allies ostensibly, they don't particularly like each other. I was told that by multiple Russian contacts inside Syria. They deal with them from, again, a very pragmatic basis. But they will ally with Israel to exclude Iran from the region and also to prevent Turkish expansionism. So there is the kind of collaboration point between Israel and Russia, which I think is a very important one, and it's something that people are not addressing at all.
Well, this is what I mean. Huh? This is why everybody who's watching the show needs to listen to you guys as well, because you guys always have just such a different angle and good information on what is going on. I mean, that whole idea about that Russia is so often in cahoots with Israel, but also that you just said that they actually align with Israel against Iran in some cases. Russia
was always, I know it's going through this whole strategic partnership with Iran, but Fee can maybe kind of expand on that conversation. But my understanding of the 10 years that I spent in Syria, 5 years living there and speaking to Russian military, Russian diplomats, Russian intelligence reconciliation people there, Iran was a competitor in the region. It was always seen as a competitor. And so for Russia, I think it's beneficial for them. And that might be part of their strategic deal with Iran, that Iran stays out of the region and leaves Russia to run what influence it still has in Syria, for example. I don't know. That's my own speculation. And obviously, yes, the prevention of Turkish expansionism into Syria. We've seen Israel bombing central Syria, the T4 base and Palmyra and northern Hama, which was a clear message to Turkey that you can stay where you are in the north, but you're not expanding into central Syria. And that was part of the negotiations recently in Azerbaijan. But Israel has also been bombing Turkish-backed factions that are, to some degree, threatening to the Russian presence on the coast, because Russia has been downing Turkish faction drones, for example, over the Haimamin base. And Israel has very kindly bombed those factions for Israel in the last couple of weeks.
Maybe you want to jump in, Fiorella?
Well, I think she said everything about um Russia's role in Syria, but what I will also add about, this, what you had mentioned about being unable to criticize, is the fact that this is coming from actual data, actual sources, actual people on the ground. And it really, I think there's a level of cognitive dissonance that we're seeing happen because people have placed their own ideas of what Russia is or what China is or whatever into this whole thing. And one of the things that I saw happening was this Iranian and Russian strategic partnership. And as Vanessa said, sure, that's happening. But when you look at the fine print, that is not a binding treaty that, for example, if Iran is attacked, say by the United States or Israel, Russia has very clearly stated they will not get militarily involved. They will refer to the UN Charter, as they always do. In comparison to the North Korean military strategic partnership that they have, that one is actually it has a military binding of sorts, where if there is an intervention on North Korea, Russia will get militarily involved unless they have a little clause in there that says unless they don't see a need to. There's a specific, once again, UN Charter category that they can refer to, but that one specifically states that that is a military type of bond that they have. And when you compare the two, you see the differences, and you look at to North Korea's role. Obviously, they're a military power. They have superior military weapons. They have long been in cahoots with Russia through the Soviet Union. But with the Soviet Union, they had a different alliance that had zero clauses of, well, if this happens, and no, it was very much a military partnership without any sort of exceptions. It was just straight military partnership. North Korea isn't really involved in anything that's happening in West Asia for the most part. And you have Iran and this relationship with Iran. As Vanessa said, Iran is also might be an ally, but it's also a competitor for the region. And on top of that, you have the relationship that Russia has with Israel. And that relationship isn't going anywhere because it's also an ethnic relationship. And it's also a relationship that exists in Russia in terms of the oligarchy that remains in power is largely Zionist in its consistency. And that's something people don't talk about. As well as the media. The media in the beginning of January, in the beginning of October 7th, the media was very, very hesitant in Russia to call it a genocide. And this is something I experienced myself in having difficulty in calling it a genocide and having difficulty in speaking against Israel in the way because of Israel's involvement, even in that as well. So when we talk about this relationship between Russia and Israel, it's something that can't be ignored. If you call yourself an anti-Zionist, if you call yourself an anti-imperialist, you need to talk about it at the very least. You can respect Russia's decisions. I don't think anybody here is trying to tell XY country how to conduct its affairs, but what we are doing is explaining what actually is happening in terms of the real politic type of scenarios that we're seeing. And then we had the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, where they both agreed that it was they will not allow Iran to destroy Israel, that Israel needed to exist essentially. And when I posted that out there, I had so many people say, "You, why did you post the US version and not the Russian version?" And then I posted what Russian state media had translated, and it said the same thing. And then people were like, well, no, but you need to look at the Kremlin. I'm like, well, the Kremlin doesn't always tell you everything, because they were focused on Russia Ukraine. So the Kremlin only put out the brief statement on Russia Ukraine. They didn't put out the whole thing that also went into discussing the Middle East, Iran nuclear deal, blah blah blah. And I said, I know this because this is just how they operate, and I'm literally in Russia. And then they're like, no, but you don't understand. I don't think Russia would do that. I don't think they would say that. And I was like, well, why wouldn't they? Like, they have a relationship with Israel. They've always had one. What are you talking about? Like, why would they want 1.3 million Russians to be, bombed by Iran? Like, obviously, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you think that they wouldn't do that? Because you have set up an idea of Russia that isn't what Russia actually is. And I, as you who live in China, I love Russia. I think Russians are amazing. I'm married to a Russian. I mean, this is like, this is for me, it's like I actually understand the region of where I live. I talk to normal people, not just politicians, and not just people who can who I don't do it just for the red carpet treatment. I'm not a Westerner that's just coming in and getting a one layered version of what this country is. And I think that there's a lot of that happening, to tie it all together, right? Of what we're talking about. There's a lot of that happening where, Westerners are being flown in, and they're just giving this red carpet treatment, or they're giving one layer version of what this country is. And Tucker Carlson comes in and he goes to the grocery store and he's like, "Oh, it's so cheap here." Yeah, for Americans. But there is a lot of that propaganda, and that is propaganda, whether it's Russian, whether it's Chinese, whether it's from wherever. And I get it in terms of wanting to combat the Western narrative that everything is bad here and all of that. But at the same time, there is a lot of lacking of understanding how things really are. And people have created ideals that simply don't exist. And I think that there needs to be rather an honest analysis of things, and you don't really get that analysis if you're just going to be hanging out with everybody that works at RT, or everybody that works at a certain type of political journalist Western media. You get that by hanging out with the locals, by understanding the culture, by trying to understand the language, and so on and so forth. So I think Vanessa does this, and I've seen it, with a few other people. But for the vast majority of Westerners who go to these other countries, they stay in this like expat bubble where they're just like, it's basically they might as well be at home, because they're literally living a completely different reality than the people that are living in these countries experience. And sure, you can do that because you have the funds, but you need to make yourself not do that if you're trying to actually do real journalism, and if you're trying to actually get to the bottom. Because when you look at things from the ground up and also analyze the international geopolitics that's happening, I think that's when you get the closest to what the reality is as to what's occurring.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also wanted to say that that's also a typical Western thing, that the kind of competition, identity, inter-identity competition, team red, team blue, and it's also with the whole Russia thing. You know, you're if you're an anti-imperialist, don't say anything about Russia or China, and if you're pro-US, then don't say anything bad about the West and all that kind of stuff. And you guys bring a very much more needed, nuanced discussion about these things. And it shows also, for example, Russia, even if Russia would rise, let's say Russia would rise and become one of the major new poles. Let's say it would rise, it becomes, in a fantasy world, it becomes the superpower. Then Israel would probably have the same role. If you think about it right now. I mean, if Israel is so important still for Russia, with so many Russians there, you know what I mean? It's like, what role would Russia play in a world like that? Sorry, Israel play in a world like that, you know? But I'm just hypothesizing here. Anyway,
and of course, Israel has huge influence in Ukraine. That shouldn't be forgotten either, and that's why I'm saying that Israel probably would have been instrumental, or at least a part of the pre-negotiations with Trump on Ukraine, for sure, because that's where Russia and Israel, if you like, had parted ways, because Israel was openly supporting Nazis in Ukraine. And Ukraine had been training Jolani's forces in Idlib for about a year before the final fall of Damascus. So, you know, for me, there has to be some kind of meshing here between Israel and Russia for the events to have taken place that did. And I think to kind of ignore that or to deny it, as Fee said, is just confirmation bias for people that have this ideological vision of what Russia should be or China should be. And I also want to make the point, not all Russians think the same way. There are people even who were formerly in Syria. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there were people at very high level that even a few years ago told me on the ground that Russia's interfering too much in Syria. It's like it's not right, right? And so there are voices in Russia that are against Russian policy. It's not a kind of homogenous policy that is supported by everyone in that country. Probably the same in China. I'm not very sort of up on China's policies and so on and so forth, other than, you know, globally. But when you're living in a country, you can see that. There's huge discrepancy between the government's foreign policy and the opinions of the people on the ground, as Fee said. And that is something that I want to also make very clear. I'm not condemning every single Russian for what happened in Syria or for what Russia has done elsewhere. No, there's some very good minds. There's some very good people who do put morality and humanity above realpolitik and pragmatism in Russia, in China, in every country in the world. And those are the people that we should be trying to mesh with. Those are the people that we should be giving voices to. And those are the people that should be at least having influence on our future as humanity, not just divided up into global regions.
Yes, indeed.
Well said. Well, you guys have been super generous with your time, and to be honest, I could go on. There's so much more. I know you guys have so much more wealth of knowledge that we could tap into, but I guess we have to let you go this time. But I hope you allow us to invite you guys again in the future, and then hopefully we can continue this great conversation.
It's been really nice talking to you guys as well. Actually, it's a refreshing change to be able to have that conversation civilly and respectfully, and you know, to go deeper into the whole subject. So thank you for having us on also.
Our pleasure.
Our pleasure, and thank you guys for all the work that you do, and definitely if to our audience. Search Fiorella, Isabel, and Vanessa Beeley. They do excellent work on what is going on in the world, especially from an anti-imperialist lens. And are there any specific platforms that you say, hey, you look us up there? Maybe Substack, Twitter, I don't know.
Yeah, well, for me, Substack, Twitter/X. You can find me at Fiorella Isabel M on that. You can find me at Fiorella in Moscow on Telegram. But yeah, Substack has been a really great platform, and I'm also on Truthwire at YouTube and Rumble as well.
Yeah, pretty much the same. Substack, X, I'm always just Vanessa Beeley. Telegram, Patreon I still have, on YouTube. Those are the main ones. But Substack is the main one these days, as long as it lasts.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, looking forward to our next talk, and stay well. Try to stay out of depression, and we'll do the same.
And I just want to say one more thing though. The one-on-one talks that you regularly do on your YouTube channel, Vanessa, is something that people should really listen to. I'm a very big fan when you two talk about the things that are going on in the world. So please keep doing that. I will keep listening.
We will.
And we will
Thank
we will definitely invite you again in the future. But for now, thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you so
very
much. Take care, guys.
All right. Thanks.
Peace,
Bye.
guys. Bye.
Bye.
حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي انا حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي تكتيكي تكتيكي